Saturday morning, September 12, 1959. The autumn air in Manhattan carried that crisp promise of change that New Yorkers who remembered the Great Depression still appreciated. President Eisenhower was in his final years in the White House. The nation was prosperous, and most Americans believed the worst troubles were behind them. But in the shadowy world of organized crime, Saturday, September 12th, would become the day that changed everything. St. Anthony's Cathedral stood like a limestone fortress in the heart of Little Italy, its Gothic spires reaching toward heaven while harboring some of the most dangerous men in America. At precisely 2:47 p.m., as church bells chimed across lower Manhattan, a solitary figure emerged from a gleaming black Cadillac Eldorado, the kind of automobile that cost more than most families earned in 3 years. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stepped onto the sidewalk wearing a charcoal gray suit tailored by the same craftsman who dressed Italian dons, his shoes polished to mirror brightness, carrying an ivory wedding invitation that shouldn't have existed. The invitation bore elegant embossed lettering requesting his presence at the wedding of Maria Genovese, niece of the most powerful crime boss in New York. Inside that cathedral, 300 Italian-American mobsters were celebrating the social event of the decade in organized crime circles. And Bumpy Johnson, the undisputed king of Harlem, was the only black man invited. Not invited as an honor. Invited as a test that was supposed to end with his death. For those who lived through the 1950s, you'll remember it as the era of Leave It to Beaver and backyard barbecues, when America projected an image of suburban prosperity and racial harmony. But beneath that polished surface, the criminal underworld operated by different rules entirely. In 1959, the color line in organized crime was as rigid as a steel wall, and crossing it without permission usually meant crossing into eternity. What made this invitation extraordinary wasn't just its rarity, it was its impossibility. Italian crime families, descendants of immigrants who had built their power through decades of violence and careful tradition, simply didn't socialize with black criminals. Ever, the two worlds existed in parallel, occasionally conducting business, but never mixing socially. Yet here was Bumpy Johnson, holding an engraved invitation to the most exclusive Cosa Nostra wedding of the decade, an event that would bring together crime families from New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia, and Boston, men who controlled labor unions, political machines, and illegal enterprises worth millions of dollars annually. The invitation had arrived 3 days earlier under mysterious circumstances. No messenger, no explanation, just an elegant envelope slipped beneath the door of Bumpy's office, above the Rhythm Club on Lenox Avenue. When he opened it and saw the embossed lettering requesting his presence at what everyone knew would be a gathering of America's most dangerous criminals, he understood immediately. Someone wanted him dead, and they wanted it done with style, surrounded by witnesses who would spread the word that accommodation between Italian and black crime organizations was officially over. What nobody knew, not Vito Genovese, not his ambitious nephew Little Tony, not the 300 killers who would fill those cathedral pews, was that Bumpy Johnson had spent those 3 days preparing for war, but not the kind of war anyone expected. By the time he walked through those massive wooden church doors, he had already won. To understand why this wedding invitation was essentially a beautifully engraved death warrant, you need to understand the delicate balance of power that existed in New York's underworld during the final years of the Eisenhower administration. It was a time when America was changing rapidly. The suburbs were expanding, television was transforming family life, and the civil rights movement was beginning to challenge segregation throughout the South. But in the criminal underworld, change came slowly and violently. The Italian families had controlled most organized crime since the establishment of the Commission in 1931. The same year that saw the completion of the Empire State Building and marked America's descent into the Great Depression. They had territories as clearly defined as European kingdoms, traditions passed down through generations, and strict rules about who could operate where and under what conditions. These weren't the Hollywood gangsters that would later populate movies and television shows. These were businessmen who happened to conduct their business outside the law, sophisticated, educated, and absolutely ruthless when their authority was challenged. Many had fought in World War II, had seen combat in places like Anzio and Normandy, and brought military discipline to their criminal enterprises. Harlem had always been different. Black neighborhoods were considered secondary markets, where Italian families could collect tribute but didn't need to maintain direct control. It was an arrangement that suited everyone. Italian bosses received steady income without the complications of managing street-level operations in communities they didn't understand, while black operators like Bumpy Johnson could build their own empires within clearly defined boundaries. For nearly 3 decades, this system had worked remarkably well. Bumpy Johnson had built his empire in this gray area, paying percentages to Italian bosses while maintaining independence that most black operators never achieved. His numbers racket alone generated hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, and his influence extended far beyond gambling into legitimate businesses, political connections, and social programs that made him a beloved figure in Harlem. But by 1959, that arrangement was changing, and the change was being driven by the same generational conflicts that were transforming America itself. Young Italian mobsters, men who had grown up during World War II and come of age during the prosperous 1950s, saw Harlem's numbers racket generating millions annually and wanted direct control. They had attended the same schools as legitimate businessmen, understood modern finance and marketing, and viewed Bumpy's independence as an insult to Italian authority, a violation of the natural order where white gangsters commanded and black gangsters obeyed. These young Turks looked at the civil rights movement and saw dangerous possibilities. If black Americans could challenge segregation in legitimate society, what would prevent black criminals from challenging Italian supremacy in the underworld? Better to establish dominance immediately, before accommodation became expectation. Don Vito Genovese represented the old-school Italian bosses who believed accommodation with powerful black criminals was smart business. At 72 years old, he had survived Prohibition, the Great Depression, and World War II by understanding that flexibility created more opportunities than rigidity. He respected Bumpy Johnson's intelligence, his restraint, and his ability to maintain order in Harlem without creating problems for Italian operations. But his nephew, Anthony "Little Tony" Genovese, represented the new generation that wanted total Italian dominance over all criminal enterprises in New York. At 38, Little Tony had served as a lieutenant in the Pacific Theater during World War II, had seen what American power could accomplish when properly organized, and believed that organized crime needed the same kind of hierarchical structure that had won the war. The wedding invitation was Little Tony's idea, a brilliant trap that would eliminate Harlem's most powerful black gangster while sending an unmistakable message to every other black operator in New York. The era of accommodation was over. The time for submission had arrived. Get Bumpy into a controlled environment surrounded by Italian soldiers. Make it look like an honor, a sign of respect for his achievements. Then arrange an accident during the reception that eliminated him while demonstrating that even the most intelligent black criminal couldn't match Italian sophistication and planning. Bumpy Johnson recognized the trap immediately. But he also recognized something that Little Tony had overlooked in his eagerness to prove his superiority. Every trap contained the seeds of its own destruction, and the most dangerous opponent was always the one who understood your strengths better than you did. Monday morning, September 9th, 1959. 3 days before the wedding that would either make Bumpy Johnson a legend or make him a corpse. The Rhythm Club sat on the corner of Lenox Avenue and 135th Street, like a jewel in Harlem's crown, its neon sign dark in the early morning light, but promising the kind of sophisticated entertainment that drew visitors from Park Avenue penthouses and Brooklyn tenements alike. Above the club, behind a door marked Private Business, Bumpy Johnson maintained his headquarters in an office that would have impressed Wall Street executives. The office reflected the mahogany desk from England, leather chairs from Italy, Persian rugs that cost more than most families' annual rent, and bookshelves lined with volumes ranging from Sun Tzu's The Art of War to Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. This wasn't the stereotypical gangster's lair filled with guns and gambling equipment. This was the command center of a sophisticated businessman who happened to operate outside the law. Bumpy sat behind that mahogany desk at 7:30 a.m., long before most of Harlem stirred to life, studying the ivory wedding invitation with the same intensity that General Eisenhower had once studied intelligence reports before D-Day. The morning sunlight, streaming through bulletproof windows, illuminated the elegant script, but Bumpy was reading between the lines, analyzing every word for hidden meanings and deadly implications. Junie Bird arrived first, as he had every morning for the past 15 years. At 58, Junie was Bumpy's oldest lieutenant, a man who had served time in Sing Sing during the 1920s, and emerged with connections throughout New York's criminal underworld, and an understanding of prison politics that proved invaluable in legitimate business negotiations. His weathered face told the story of 2 decades on Harlem streets, but his sharp mind remained as precise as a Swiss timepiece. "Morning, boss," Junie said, settling into the leather chair across from Bumpy's desk. "Coffee's brewing downstairs, and I've got the numbers from the weekend. Brooklyn crews pulled in $18,000, Manhattan operations cleared $24,000, and the Bronx territory generated $12,000. Total take $54,000 for 3 days' work." In 1959, $54,000 represented serious money, enough to buy 20 new Cadillacs or a mansion in the suburbs where middle-class families were pursuing the American dream. But more importantly, it demonstrated the scope of Bumpy's operation and explained why Italian families were interested in gaining direct control over Harlem's numbers racket. Illinois Gordon entered the office at precisely 8 a.m., punctual as always. At 45, Illinois stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 280 pounds, most of it muscle developed during his youth, working construction on the George Washington Bridge, and refined during 5 years in the Army during World War II. He had served in the Pacific Theater, had seen combat in the Philippines, and brought military discipline to his role as Bumpy's primary enforcer. "Boss," Illinois said, his deep voice carrying the slight Southern accent that revealed his Mississippi origins. "Word's already spreading about that invitation. Street talk says the Italians are planning something special for Saturday. My sources in Brooklyn heard little Tony's been meeting with soldiers from 3 different families." Finally, at 8:15 a.m., Ellsworth Bumps Washington arrived carrying a leather briefcase filled with the intelligence reports that made him invaluable to Bumpy's operation. At 32, Bumps was the youngest member of Bumpy's inner circle, but his mind worked like a chess grandmaster's, always thinking several moves ahead and calculating probabilities that others couldn't see. Bumps had attended Howard University on a scholarship before family circumstances forced him to leave school and enter the numbers business. His education, combined with his street smarts and his ability to analyze complex situations, made him Bumpy's strategic advisor and the architect of many successful operations. "Gentlemen," Bumpy said, setting the invitation on his desk where all 3 men could see it, "we have a situation that requires careful consideration and perfect execution." For the next hour, the 4 men analyzed every aspect of the wedding invitation and its implications. They discussed the political dynamics within the Genovese family, the generational conflicts between old-school dons and young ambitious nephews, and the broader changes occurring in New York's criminal landscape as the 1950s drew to a close. "Boss," Junie said finally, "this is the most obvious setup I've seen since the St. Valentine's Day massacre. You walk into that church, you're not walking out. 300 Italian soldiers, 1 exit, and you're the only brother in the building. Those ain't good odds for anybody, no matter how smart." Illinois nodded grimly, his massive hands clasped in his lap. "They're expecting you to either show up and get killed, or stay away and look weak. Either way, they win and we lose. Face throughout the organization. But there's got to be another option." But Bumps was thinking strategically, his mind working through possibilities that the others hadn't considered. What if it's not about the odds? What if it's not even about winning or losing in the traditional sense? What if it's about changing the entire game so that the usual rules don't apply? Bumpy studied his youngest advisor with interest. "Explain that." "They're expecting you to react like a typical gangster." Bumps continued, opening his briefcase and pulling out a folder filled with research. "Either show up ready for war, or stay away and admit defeat. But what if you showed up as something completely different? What if you approached this wedding not as a gangster attending a criminal gathering, but as a sophisticated gentleman celebrating a legitimate social occasion. The suggestion hung in the air, like smoke from expensive cigars. It was so unexpected, so contrary to everything they knew about Italian-Black relations and organized crime, that initially none of them knew how to respond. You're talking about walking into enemy territory without protection, without weapons, without backup, and trusting that good manners will keep you alive. Junie said slowly. That's either the smartest thing I've ever heard, or the dumbest. But Bumpy was beginning to understand the brilliance of the suggestion. Weddings have rules, he said thoughtfully. Ancient traditions that even killers respect. Sacred customs that create opportunities for those intelligent enough to exploit them. What Bumpy understood that the Italian mobsters planning his death didn't was that weddings represented something larger than criminal enterprise. They represented family, tradition, and cultural values that transcended business rivalries and personal vendettas. In Italian culture, a wedding guest who brought an appropriate gift and showed proper respect to the bride's family was entitled to protection until the celebration ended. To violate that protection, to harm a welcomed guest at a wedding celebration, would bring the kind of bad luck that Italian families feared more than police raids or rival gang wars. It was superstition, perhaps, but superstitions that had survived for generations often contained practical wisdom that sophisticated criminals ignored at their peril. I need information, Bumpy said decisively. Everything we can find out about Italian wedding customs, family politics, within the Genovese organization, and the specific arrangements for Saturday's ceremony and reception. Tuesday, September 10th. While most of America was reading headlines about Nikita Khrushchev's upcoming visit to the United States and the growing tensions of the Cold War, Bumpy Johnson was conducting his own intelligence operation that would determine whether he lived to see the 1960s. The first call was to Sammy the Fish DeLuca, an Italian numbers runner who worked Bumpy's East Harlem territory. DeLuca owed Bumpy his life after Bumpy had prevented a rival Puerto Rican gang from killing him during a territorial dispute in 1957. That debt was about to be called in. Sammy operated out of a barbershop on 116th Street that served as neutral ground between Italian and Black territories. At 43, he had been running numbers for 20 years and knew the gossip, politics, and internal dynamics of Italian families throughout New York. More importantly, he had relatives who worked for the Genovese organization and access to information that could mean the difference between survival and death. Sammy? Bumpy said quietly, when DeLuca answered his telephone. I need information about the Genovese wedding on Saturday. Guest list, security arrangements, family politics, everything you can find out without getting yourself killed. DeLuca's voice was nervous, and Bumpy could hear the fear clearly. Boss, asking questions about that wedding could get me whacked. Those people don't like outsiders knowing their business. Not asking could get me whacked, Bumpy replied calmly. And if I die, who protects you from the Puerto Rican crews that still want your territory? Who makes sure your numbers operation stays profitable? Who keeps your enemies from moving in on your family? The implication was clear. Sammy owed his survival and prosperity to Bumpy's protection, and that protection came with obligations. Within 24 hours, DeLuca had provided intelligence that would prove crucial to Bumpy's survival strategy. The wedding would have minimal security inside St. Anthony's Cathedral. Italian tradition demanded that weapons be left outside during religious ceremonies. The reception would be held at the Genovese family compound in Brooklyn. But the church ceremony itself was considered neutral ground where violence was strictly forbidden. Most importantly, DeLuca revealed the family dynamics that were driving this situation. Don Vito Genovese was actually opposed to killing Bumpy at the wedding, considering it disrespectful to his niece Maria and potentially damaging to the family's reputation within Italian-American communities. But little Tony had convinced several young hothead cousins that eliminating Bumpy during the reception would send the right message about Italian supremacy and establish his credentials as a future leader. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Bumpy would be approached during the reception by men claiming to escort him to a private meeting with Don Genovese. Once isolated from witnesses, he would be killed and his body disposed of, with the official story being that he had left the wedding early and disappeared on his way back to Harlem. By the time anyone realized he was missing, his death would be old news and his organization would be leaderless. But intelligence was only the first step. Bumpy's survival would depend on understanding Italian wedding customs so thoroughly that he could use their own traditions against them. The second call was to Father Michael Torino, the only Italian priest in New York who would hear confessions from black gangsters. Father Torino operated St. Mark's Church on the border between Harlem and Little Italy, serving both communities despite considerable pressure from Italian families who disapproved of his inclusive policies. Father Torino represented something rare in 1959 New York, a man whose religious convictions transcended racial boundaries. He had grown up in Little Italy, understood Italian customs and superstitions intimately, but had chosen to serve God rather than cultural prejudices. He knew Bumpy Johnson's reputation for intelligence and restraint, and unlike most clergymen, he didn't judge gangsters more harshly than legitimate businessmen who exploited workers or politicians who accepted bribes. "Father," Bumpy said when he visited St. Mark's on Wednesday morning, "I need your guidance about Italian wedding traditions. Specifically, the customs that protect wedding guests and the obligations of families toward people who show proper respect." Father Torino had known Bumpy for 8 years, ever since Bumpy had donated $5,000 to rebuild the church's organ after a fire. He understood that Bumpy's questions weren't academic. Someone's life depended on getting the details exactly right. "There are ancient customs," Father Torino explained, settling into a worn wooden chair in his office, "that create sacred obligations between wedding hosts and their guests. If you approach this wedding as a genuine celebration of matrimony rather than as a criminal gathering, and if you demonstrate appropriate honor to the bride's family, then you become entitled to protection that supersedes business rivalries or personal vendettas." "And if someone violates those customs?" Bumpy asked. Father Torino was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "Italian families believe that harming a respectful wedding guest brings misfortune to the entire family line. Bad luck that lasts for generations, affecting children and grandchildren who had nothing to do with the original offense. Even the most ruthless Don wouldn't risk that kind of curse." But customs and superstitions would only provide protection if Bumpy could demonstrate knowledge of Italian traditions so profound that killing him would become culturally impossible. That required a wedding gift that would prove his respect wasn't mere calculation, but genuine appreciation for Italian heritage and customs. The third call was to Ruby Washington, the most exclusive caterer in Harlem, a woman whose reputation for elegance and sophistication had made her wealthy, serving both black social elite and white clients who appreciated quality regardless of the provider's race. Ruby understood luxury, tradition, and the symbolic importance of gifts in establishing social relationships. "Ruby," Bumpy said when he visited her East Harlem office on Wednesday afternoon, "I need you to create the most impressive Italian wedding gift anyone has ever seen. Money is no object, but it has to demonstrate such deep understanding of their customs that they'll be forced to acknowledge my respect." Ruby Washington was 51 years old, had been running her catering business for 15 years, and had provided services for events ranging from political fundraisers to society weddings. She understood that the right gift could open doors that money alone couldn't unlock, and that cultural sensitivity often mattered more than extravagant expense. Working with Italian craftsmen and Jewish jewelers, Ruby created a gift that would become legendary in mob circles: a hand-carved olive wood jewelry box, inlaid with mother-of-pearl depicting scenes from Italian wedding folklore, containing a complete set of sterling silver serving pieces engraved with the Genovese family crest and the date of the wedding. The gift cost Bumpy $15,000. More than most American families earned in 2 years during the prosperous 1950s. But it demonstrated knowledge of Italian wedding customs that even some Italian Americans didn't possess. The olive wood symbolized peace and prosperity in Mediterranean cultures. The mother-of-pearl represented purity and good fortune for the new marriage. The serving pieces would be used for generations, making Bumpy's gift part of the family's heritage forever. But the most crucial element was the card that accompanied the gift, handwritten in Italian, that Bumpy had learned phonetically from Father Torino. To the blessed union of two souls, may your marriage bring honor to your families and prosperity to your children. With deepest respect for your traditions and gratitude for your hospitality, Ellsworth Johnson. The card would prove that Bumpy understood Italian as more than just the language of his enemies. He respected it as the language of tradition, family, and cultural heritage that deserved acknowledgement from anyone seeking acceptance in Italian social circles. Wednesday and Thursday were dedicated to the most crucial preparation, ensuring that Bumpy's survival didn't depend entirely on Italian superstitions and wedding customs. Intelligence and respect would get him through the church doors alive, but staying alive required backup plans, escape routes, and leverage that would make killing him more expensive than letting him live. Thursday morning, September 11th, found Bumpy in a series of meetings that would have impressed Pentagon strategists. He was operating on multiple levels simultaneously: diplomatic, strategic, and psychological. Each conversation was designed to create consequences that would make his murder costly enough to discourage even the most ambitious young Italian gangsters. The first meeting was at Small's Paradise on 135th Street, the legendary jazz club where Duke Ellington had once held court, and where Harlem's most sophisticated criminals conducted business surrounded by the elegance of America's premier black entertainment district. Bumpy sat in a back booth with Marcus the Detroit Kid Williams, who controlled numbers operations throughout Brooklyn's black neighborhoods. Marcus was 48 years old, had built his organization through careful expansion and strategic alliances, and commanded respect from both black operators and Italian families who collected tribute from his territory. He understood the implications of Bumpy's potential death better than most people realized. "Marcus," Bumpy said quietly, "if something happens to me on Saturday, it changes everything for all of us. The Italians will interpret my death as proof that accommodation doesn't work, that the only relationship they want with black operators is complete subordination." Marcus nodded gravely. "They start with you, they'll move on to all of us within 6 months. Can't have that." They negotiated a mutual defense agreement that would activate immediately if Bumpy was killed under suspicious circumstances. Marcus would coordinate with black crime organizations in Newark and the Bronx to retaliate against Italian operations in black neighborhoods, starting a race war that would cost everyone millions and attract federal attention that the mob desperately wanted to avoid. The second meeting was even more sensitive. Bumpy drove to a warehouse in Queens, where he met with Tommy Three Fingers Torino, an Italian bookkeeper who managed financial records for 4 different crime families. Tommy was Father Torino's cousin, a man who had discovered discrepancies in family accounting that could destroy several reputations if the information reached the wrong people. For 2 years, Bumpy had been cultivating Tommy as a source, paying him $500 monthly for intelligence about Italian family operations, financial arrangements, and internal politics. That investment was about to pay its most important dividend. "Tommy," Bumpy said, sliding an envelope containing $2,000 across the warehouse table, "if I die on Saturday, I want you to understand what happens next." Through Tommy, Bumpy had discovered that several Italian families were skimming money from their tribute payments to the commission, violating the sacred rule that all bosses contributed equally to the organization's expenses. The discrepancies weren't large, a few percentage points here and there, but they represented hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, and more importantly, demonstrated disrespect for commission authority. Bumpy had detailed records of these violations, including bank statements and testimony from corrupted accountants. If he died under suspicious circumstances, this information would be released to commission bosses through channels that couldn't be traced back to Tommy, triggering internal Italian wars that would make Bumpy's death seem insignificant by comparison. But the most crucial element of Bumpy's survival strategy was psychological warfare, designed to make Little Tony's trap backfire spectacularly. Friday afternoon, September 11th, Bumpy arranged for 3 black newspapers, the Amsterdam News, the Pittsburgh Courier, and the Chicago Defender, to have photographers outside St. Anthony's Cathedral on Saturday. The official story was that these photographers would document the unprecedented integration of an exclusive Italian social event, capturing images of Bumpy Johnson as the first black guest ever invited to a major Cosa Nostra wedding. If anything happened to Bumpy, the story would become front-page news in every major black newspaper in America. Harlem crime king murdered after accepting Italian wedding invitation. The publicity would make Italian families look like they had violated sacred wedding traditions to murder a guest who had shown proper respect, damaging their reputation in Italian-American communities, where honor and tradition mattered more than criminal success. But Bumpy's most dangerous gamble was a personal letter he had written to J. Edgar Hoover, director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The letter, sealed and prepared for delivery, explained the wedding invitation and its implications. If Bumpy died on Saturday, the letter would be delivered Monday morning, providing the FBI with detailed information about Italian family operations, internal conflicts, and the location of Saturday's gathering. Hoover had been trying to infiltrate Italian crime families for years without significant success. The promise of intelligence about the most exclusive Cosa Nostra social gathering of the decade would make Bumpy's murder the FBI's highest priority investigation, bringing federal attention that could destroy families and end careers. Friday evening, as the sun set over Manhattan and most Americans prepared for weekend relaxation, Bumpy received an unexpected visitor at his Harlem office. Salvatore "Sally Bugs" Bergoglio, one of Don Genovese's most trusted lieutenants, arrived without appointment and without the usual protocol of requesting meetings through intermediaries. Sally Bugs was 53 years old, had survived Prohibition wars and Depression-era gang conflicts, and represented the old-school Italian approach to criminal business: violence when necessary, negotiation when possible, and always honor your word once given. His presence at Bumpy's office suggested that the situation had become more complex than anyone anticipated. "Mr. Johnson," Sally Bugs said, sitting across from Bumpy's mahogany desk without being invited, "I understand you're planning to attend Maria's wedding tomorrow." Bumpy studied Sally Bugs' expression, looking for tells that would indicate whether this was a final attempt to discourage his attendance or something more sophisticated. "I received an invitation. I intend to honor it." "You understand that some people question whether your presence is appropriate," Sally Bugs continued. "Whether it respects the traditions of our families. I understand that some people prefer to settle differences through violence rather than through respect and negotiation," Bumpy replied carefully. "But wedding guests who bring appropriate gifts and show proper honor to the bride's family are entitled to safety. That's not my rule, that's your rule." For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Sally Bugs smiled. Not a threatening expression, but genuine appreciation for intelligence and preparation. "You've done your homework," Sally Bugs said. "Most people in your position would either refuse the invitation or show up ready for war. You're doing something completely different. I'm showing respect for your traditions while protecting my interests. Same thing every successful businessman does." Sally Bugs stood up, straightening his expensive suit. "Mr. Johnson, I want you to understand something important. This wedding invitation wasn't approved by Don Genovese. It was sent by young hotheads who believe killing you will solve problems that actually require more sophisticated solutions." The revelation confirmed Bumpy's analysis, but also created new dangers. Internal Italian family politics could override traditional protections, making the situation more volatile than simple business rivalry. "What happens tomorrow depends on how you conduct yourself," Sally Bugs continued. "If you come as a respectful guest celebrating a wedding, you'll be treated accordingly. If you come looking for trouble, you'll find more than you can handle." After Sally Bugs departed, Bumpy understood that Saturday's events would determine not just his survival, but the future relationship between Italian and Black organized crime throughout New York. Success would establish precedents for cooperation. Failure would trigger conflicts that could last for decades. Saturday morning, September 12, 1959. The day that would either make Bumpy Johnson a legend or make him a memory. Bumpy woke at 6 a.m. in his Lenox Avenue apartment, a spacious residence that reflected his success without flaunting wealth in ways that would attract unnecessary attention from law enforcement or rivals. He dressed carefully in the charcoal gray suit that had been tailored by Morty Sills, the same craftsman who made suits for Italian dons, choosing accessories that demonstrated sophistication without ostentation. At 10 a.m., he attended morning services at Abyssinian Baptist Church, where Congressman Adam Clayton Powell Jr. delivered a sermon about courage and conviction that seemed particularly relevant to the day's challenges. Bumpy had been attending services regularly for 15 years, not from religious conversion, but from understanding that community respect required visible participation in institutions that mattered to Harlem's residents. At 1:30 p.m., Bumpy's black Cadillac Eldorado pulled away from the Rhythm Club, beginning the journey from Harlem to Little Italy that would take him across more than just geographic boundaries. He was accompanied by Illinois Gordon and Bumps Washington, who would wait outside the cathedral during the ceremony but remain available if circumstances required immediate assistance. The drive through Manhattan on Saturday afternoon provided time for final mental preparation. They passed construction sites where the future would rise, new office buildings, apartment complexes, and shopping centers that represented America's continued prosperity. But they were heading toward institutions and traditions that had survived since the 1880s, when Italian immigrants first established their communities in Lower Manhattan. At 2:30 p.m., the Cadillac stopped in front of St. Anthony's Cathedral. The street was lined with luxury automobiles, Cadillacs, Lincolns, Chryslers, and Packards, that represented the wealth and power of Italian families from across the Northeast. Men in expensive suits stood in small groups, conducting quiet conversations and observing the arrival of guests with professional interest. When Bumpy emerged from his car carrying the $15,000 wedding gift, every conversation stopped. 300 pairs of eyes turned to watch the only black man at an exclusively Italian wedding, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Bumpy walked toward the church entrance with the calm confidence that had made him legendary throughout Harlem. His posture was erect, his pace unhurried, his expression neither arrogant nor submissive, but respectful and alert. He had studied Italian body language and gesture, understanding that cultural respect required more than verbal politeness. 5 young Italian men stepped into his path as he approached the cathedral steps. They were wearing expensive suits, but their body language suggested they were soldiers rather than wedding guests. Men positioned to intercept uninvited visitors before they could enter the church. "You lost, friend?" one asked, his voice carrying enough edge to make his intent clear without being explicitly threatening in public. Bumpy stopped walking, but didn't step backward. He reached into his jacket pocket slowly, giving them time to react if they suspected he was reaching for a weapon, and pulled out the ivory wedding invitation. "I believe this is the Genovese Rossi wedding," Bumpy said politely. "I'm Ellsworth Johnson. I have an invitation." The soldiers examined the invitation, clearly surprised that it was genuine. One stepped aside to make a whispered phone call, presumably to someone inside the church who could verify this unprecedented situation. While they waited, more Italian families arrived and stopped to observe this confrontation. Word spread quickly through the crowd that Bumpy Johnson, the legendary Harlem gangster, was attempting to enter the most exclusive Italian wedding of the year. Some faces showed curiosity, others hostility, and a few genuine respect for someone with enough intelligence or courage to walk into their world uninvited. The soldier finished his phone call and returned to the group. His expression changed from hostile to uncertain. "You can go in," he said reluctantly. "But understand, you're being watched every second." Bumpy nodded respectfully. "I wouldn't expect anything different." The interior of St. Anthony's Cathedral was magnificent. Marble columns that reached toward vaulted ceilings, stained glass windows that cast colored light across polished wooden pews, and ornate decorations that demonstrated centuries of Italian craftsmanship and Catholic tradition. The church was packed with the most dangerous men in America, sitting peacefully like ordinary citizens attending a religious ceremony. Bumpy walked down the center aisle, carrying his wedding gift, aware that every person in the church was watching his progress with intense interest. Whispers followed his movement. Italian families who had never seen a black man in their social circles were trying to understand how someone like Bumpy Johnson had received an invitation to this wedding. He found an empty seat in the back row, placed the gift on the floor beside him, and waited for the ceremony to begin. The whispers continued around him, but he maintained the dignified composure that had earned him respect throughout Harlem's legitimate business community, as well as its criminal underworld. At 3 p.m. precisely, the ceremony began. Maria Genovese walked down the aisle in a white gown that had cost more than most people earned in a decade, accompanied by her father and approaching the altar where her future husband waited. The priest began the traditional Catholic wedding service, conducted in a mixture of English and Italian that honored the family's heritage while accommodating guests who might not understand the ancient language. Bumpy participated in the ceremony respectfully, standing when others stood, sitting when appropriate, and maintaining the reverent behavior expected of wedding guests. But throughout the service, he was studying the crowd, identifying faces he recognized from police photographs, memorizing seating arrangements, and noting which men seemed positioned strategically rather than sitting with their families. When the priest pronounced the couple married and the congregation erupted in applause, Bumpy joined the celebration genuinely. Whatever criminal activities had brought these people together, this was still a wedding, still a celebration of love and family commitment, still an occasion that deserved respect, regardless of the participants' other activities. As the bride and groom processed back down the aisle, followed by their families and the most important guests, he would wait until most of the church had emptied before approaching the receiving line, avoiding any appearance of pushing himself forward or demanding attention that hadn't been offered. When the church was mostly empty, Bumpy walked to the front, where the bride and groom were receiving congratulations from final guests. He waited his turn patiently, then approached with the wedding gift held respectfully in both hands. "Congratulations," Bumpy said to Maria Genovese, offering the gift with a slight bow that demonstrated knowledge of Italian courtesy. "May your marriage bring happiness and prosperity to both families." Maria accepted the gift graciously, clearly surprised by its weight and elegance. When she opened it and discovered the hand-carved olive wood box with its mother-of-pearl inlay and sterling silver serving pieces, her eyes widened with genuine appreciation. "This is beautiful," she said sincerely. "Thank you for such a thoughtful gift." Her new husband examined the serving pieces, noting the family crest engraving and the quality of craftsmanship that could only have been created by master artisans. The gift was so impressive, so clearly expensive, and demonstrated such deep knowledge of Italian wedding traditions that acknowledging its appropriateness became culturally mandatory. "You honor our family with such respect," the groom said formally, extending his hand to shake Bumpy's. "Thank you for celebrating this joyous occasion with us." But the real test came when Don Vito Genovese himself approached the receiving line. The most powerful Italian crime boss in New York studied Bumpy for several long seconds, clearly evaluating this unprecedented guest who had demonstrated such profound understanding of Italian customs and traditions. "Mr. Johnson," Don Genovese said quietly, "I understand you received an invitation to my niece's wedding." "I did, Don Genovese," Bumpy replied respectfully. "I'm honored to celebrate such a joyous occasion with your family." Don Genovese nodded slowly, his weathered face revealing decades of experience in evaluating men's character and intentions. "Your gift demonstrates deep understanding of our traditions. That kind of respect deserves recognition." What happened next shocked everyone in the church, including Bumpy himself. Don Genovese extended his hand, not for an ordinary business handshake, but for the traditional Italian gesture of respect between equals, a public acknowledgement that Bumpy Johnson was worthy of Italian recognition and entitled to the protection that such recognition implied. When Bumpy accepted the handshake, he was being welcomed into Italian social circles in a way that no black criminal had ever experienced. But the handshake served another crucial purpose. It announced to everyone present that Bumpy Johnson was under Don Genovese's personal protection during the wedding celebration. The young hotheads who had orchestrated this trap watched their carefully planned death sentence crumble into public embarrassment. Little Tony Genovese stood near the altar, his face pale with rage and frustration, understanding that his grandfather had just destroyed months of planning and preparation. The reception at the Genovese family compound in Brooklyn became a masterpiece of psychological warfare, with Bumpy transforming every element of the death trap into an opportunity for diplomatic triumph. His toast to the bride and groom earned applause from 300 Italian family members. His respectful behavior impressed older dons who had initially questioned his presence, and his obvious intelligence convinced even skeptical observers that accommodation with sophisticated black criminals offered more opportunities than confrontation. When little Tony finally attempted to isolate Bumpy for the planned execution, he discovered that his intended victim had become the evening's most celebrated guest. Bumpy's gracious toast had created a receiving line of Italian grandmothers, uncles, and family friends who wanted to thank him personally for his eloquent words and obvious respect for their traditions. By midnight, as the reception ended and guests began departing, Bumpy Johnson had achieved something unprecedented in the history of American organized crime. He had earned genuine acceptance from Italian crime families, while demonstrating that intelligence and respect could triumph over prejudice and violence. The invitation that was supposed to be his death warrant had become the foundation for a new era of cooperation between Italian and Black organized crime in New York. An era that would last until Bumpy's natural death in 1968, and establish precedents that would influence criminal organizations for generations. September 12, 1959. The day a wedding invitation changed everything, proving that the most dangerous weapon in any gangster's arsenal isn't a gun. It's a brilliant mind that understands how to turn enemies into allies and traps into triumphs.